Alright, let's do this one last time. The LEGO Across the Spider-Verse Collectable Minifigure series has been unveiled. A series which posits the question, what if Spider-Man were a horse? In this series there are 12 unique minifigures and 16 different spidery things. I'm including in that spider people, spider cats, spider horses, spider babies, and spiders? Yeah, why not? These all appear in the 2023 film Across the Spider-Verse, which is absolutely chock full of a bunch of different spider characters. Anyway, you might look at some of these and think, oh, I recognise that one. That one there is Miles Morales, the star of the film Across the Spider-Verse. And you might look at some of them and be like, what? Some kind of cyborg? What is that? Why is there a werewolf here? What's going on? In an effort to make things a little bit clearer, whether or not you've seen Across the Spider-Verse, or indeed either of the Spider-Verse films, we are now going to go through all of these characters, at least the minifigures, and talk about where these various different incarnations of Spider-Man first appeared, and why you should care about them. Let's start at the logical place, which is Miles Morales himself, Spider-Man. Or sometimes called Spin, which was new to me, even though I'm a massive Spider-Man fan. At the moment in my house, Spidey and His Amazing Friends has been playing on repeat, which is basically Muppet Babies Spider-Man. It's what if you took the Spider-Verse films and then you made them for a preschool audience. And as such, you've got Peter Parker there as Spider-Man, or just Spidey, and then you've got Gwen Stacy, who instead of being called Spider-Woman is being called Ghost Spider, and then you've got Miles Morales, and his superhero name is Spin. And I understand the challenge that you've got if you're making a show for a preschool audience and 2/3 of the characters that make up your main trio are called Spider-Man. You're going to need to invent a new name. So apparently Miles is called Spin in the show. I guess he's got some kind of spin power, but then I also like that it is just a portmanteau of Spider-Man. Anyway, to talk about Miles and his history, we need to talk about the Ultimate Comics universe. Way back at the turn of the century, Marvel had this idea that a lot of their superheroes were feeling a little bit dated and a little bit convoluted in their history, and it was becoming increasingly difficult for new comics readers to just jump in there and start reading without having years and years of prior knowledge. So they launched the Ultimate Universe, which was a kind of a refreshed retake on a bunch of these characters. Some of them are fairly faithful, as with Ultimate Spider-Man. Some of them go in completely different directions, such as, say, Iron Man and Ultimate Fantastic Four. We'll be coming back to that. But the thing you just need to know is that they decided to do a clean slate refresh of Spider-Man and just start telling stories about Peter Parker being in high school again. I feel like the success of the Ultimate Spider-Man comic in particular, which definitely is by far the most popular of all of the Ultimate comics that they did, but I feel like the success of this one has a lot to do with how every time Spider-Man gets rebooted, he always ends up back in high school. I don't feel like the character was quite as rooted in that particular life stage before the Ultimate comic, which then brought him back to that, where for years and years before that, the Amazing Spider-Man, the main Marvel comic Spider-Man, had been a grown adult doing grown adult things, getting married, having clones, that kind of thing. Also having babies, again, coming back to that. So Ultimate Spider-Man does very well over many years. It basically outlives every other Ultimate Marvel comic, but the time comes for it to be wound down, and so we get the Death of Spider-Man event where Ultimate Spider-Man dies. Now, the writer of this comic, Brian Michael Bendis, who has become like the superstar of Marvel Comics in the interim, has a plan for a brand new Spider-Man, and he invents Miles Morales alongside artist Sarah Pichelli. Miles initially debuted in the Ultimate Universe, but the Ultimate Universe was, at this point, as said, basically done, and so eventually Marvel did the Spider-Men crossover event, where the main universe Peter Parker, the guy who was still alive, although I'm not going to get into all of the twists and turns of that story, but the guy who was the main Peter Parker met the main Miles Morales from the Ultimate Universe, and they went on adventures together, and eventually Miles migrated over to the mainline Marvel Universe, Universe 616. There's going to be a lot of universe hopping in this video, I apologise in advance. Now, the Ultimate Universe is currently back. It's a little bit different. This time around, instead of being back in high school, Peter has finally moved on with his life and is a grown adult with kids himself. So if you've ever wondered what it would be like if Peter Parker were an adult man with children, a really tired dad, then finally there are Tired Dad Spider-Man comics for you. The Spider-Men crossover worked so well that Marvel said, you know what, let's just take every single Spider variant that we've ever had over the course of our history and throw them all together into one giant comic event. The Spider-Verse event has so many various different versions of Spider-Man. We are going to be talking about a few of them because many of the characters from the Spider-Verse film debuted during this event. That comic is very different to the Spider-Verse films. It features an awful lot more vampires, for one thing, but definitely the kind of the bare bones of the thing are visible in the comic in the same way that they are in the film. One such character that was invented for the Spider-Verse comic is Spider-Punk, and this one has a very interesting origin. It was originally designed by artist Olivier Coipel, who was working with Dan Slott on the main story of the comic, in which Spider-Man goes to meet the Captain Britain Corps Spider-Man. Okay, this is a bit complicated. So everything that is done in Spider-Verse was done first by Captain Britain, of all things, so we have, at least in part, Alan Moore to thank for all of this. But the idea is that all of the Captain Britons across multiple different dimensions all got together and decided we're going to be a team together and we're going to dimension hop and we're going to police the multiverse in the same kind of way that you see the TVA do it in Loki and Wolverine and Deadpool and all of these things. So that was the idea for the comic, and so they needed to design Spider UK, who was supposed to be the Captain Britain who's also Spider-Man. And Olivia designs this Spider UK character, and he is really fashionably trendily punk. And Dan Slott goes, that's not what I asked for. I needed like a Spider-Man who's like super British. And Olivia's like, yeah, this is like the most London you can possibly get. And Dan's like, yeah, but more like Captain Britain. And so they designed a different character to be Spider UK. And then they were just left with this poor Spider-Punk, and they had nowhere really to put him in. So they just kind of dropped him into the background of some scenes. He got his own spin-off comic where he is revealed to be this universe's Hobie Brown, which is a name that we'll be coming back to. It is a kind of significant moment in the comic that he pulls off the mask and we discover that this is his identity, but I'm not going to get into all of that right here. The point is, this is a character that wasn't really supposed to be anything because it was a rejected design, but it ended up being so popular, and you can see a bunch of different comic artists taking a spin on this. It's very fun to draw this character, and so he ended up gaining momentum because of that, and that's why he's in the Spider-Verse film. The Prowler. Speaking of Hobie Brown, in Into the Spider-Verse, the Prowler is Aaron Davis, Miles Morales' uncle, and that's the same as the Ultimate Universe and the origin story of Miles Morales in that comic, where his uncle was working at Oscorp, managed to get hold of one of these weird mutant spiders, and then accidentally let it out, and then it bit Miles, and that's how he got his powers. The original version of the Prowler, though, going all the way back to the 70s, was a character called Hobie Brown, who was very similar to Peter Parker in a lot of ways, and his origin story mirrors Peter's very closely. He first appeared in Spider-Man comics. He was someone who was very inventive, very creative, wanted to make a better life for himself, but didn't really know how to do it, and decided that the best thing he could do was gain a lot of fame and notoriety by being a hero. But how do you just become a hero? You can't just go out there and find villains to fight. It would be easier if he invented a villain and then saved the day himself. Very Syndrome from The Incredibles. So he makes up the Prowler, and the Prowler is going around trying to steal stuff, and then the Prowler fights with Spider-Man, and then Spider-Man removes his mask and is like, oh, well, you're just a kid, and makes the very wise decision to not shop him to the feds, to not turn him into the police, and just says, okay, do you know what, sort your life out because you're better than this. And Hobie takes him at his word and becomes the Prowler a superhero, like a good guy who's actually doing nice stuff. And that is the origin of this character, and he shows up every now and then in the main comics, but I think he really found a role in the Ultimate comics as Miles's uncle that he didn't really have in the mainline Marvel comics. So I think most people would now know him better as Aaron Davis, the uncle of Miles Morales, and potentially Miles himself, as we see in this minifigure, rather than being Hobie Brown, who now is best known as Spider-Punk. One thing I found out while researching this video that I didn't previously know is that the Prowler was originally designed by John Romita Jr., the son of John Romita Sr., who did Spider-Man comics for many, many years. Now, when John Romita Jr. designed the Prowler, he was 13 years old. And this isn't even the first time this year that we've had a story featuring a comic book artist who started at age 13. But you can imagine he's watching his dad draw Spider-Man and he's like, I want in on that. And so he makes up the Prowler, and then Stan Lee takes that character and fleshes him out and gives him a role within the story. That, I think, is really neat. I also like that because John Romita Jr. grew up to be the artist for Spider-Man and a bunch of other Marvel stuff, and personally he is my absolute favourite Marvel Comics artist. Next up, Spider-Woman, also known as Spider-Gwen, also known as Ghost Spider. There is a problem with the name Spider-Woman, and the problem is that Marvel keeps trying to make it a thing, and they've tried so many times that there are so many different versions of Spider-Woman at this point that it is difficult to keep them all straight. And if you make a new character called Spider-Woman, such as Spider-Gwen here, you end up just convoluting things further, and no one can really tell which Spider-Woman you're talking about. I guess I'm going to have to use that one clip from the Madam Web film, aren't I? Yeah, here's a bunch of Spider-Women. Anyway, Gwen Stacy as Spider-Woman, or just Spider-Gwen, was invented for the Spider-Verse comics event. Dan Slott had a very clear idea in his head of what he wanted this character to look like. She was going to be basically dressed like Gwen Stacy in her most famous of outfits from the comics, except that it was all red and blue and had webs on it, and then she had like a half-face mask that you could see just a little bit of her. You could tell that it was definitely Gwen Stacy, but she was also Spider-Man. I should probably explain Gwen Stacy just in case, just so that we cover everything in this video. Gwen Stacy was one of Peter Parker's earliest girlfriends in the comics. She was his most serious relationship at that point, and the thing that made her special was that she wasn't particularly special. She was a very normal, very sweet, very unassuming girl who didn't really have any connection to Peter Parker's Spider-Man side, with the exception that her father was the police chief. And so Peter was torn between Spider-Manning and the life that he wanted with Gwen Stacy, and then ultimately the Green Goblin threw her off a bridge. Spider-Man tried to catch her, broke her neck in the process, and that was, I think, I've heard it described as another origin story for Spider-Man, because that was the moment when he realized, I can't have a normal life. I'm always going to have to be Spider-Man first and foremost. Gwen Stacy then has been a ghost in Spider-Man comics, has been this figure that haunts Peter Parker for so much longer than she was ever alive, that her role basically in all of Spider-Man mythos is to be what we would now call fridged, is to die so that the character then gains more motivation. The idea of reinventing Gwen Stacy as a superhero in her own right is very clever, I think, because it finally gives her something to do in the story, and to a certain extent she's able to leave behind the shadow of Peter Parker because she is her own realised character now, rather than just being an appendage to him. Anyway, as said, Dan Slott had a very clear idea in his head of what he wanted Spider-Gwen to look like, but then artist Robbie Rodriguez went in a very different direction, and everybody loved it except Dan Slott for a while. He was like, that's not Spider-Gwen, I know what Spider-Gwen looks like, and then he had a moment of realisation and he was like, okay, I'm glad nobody listened to me because actually this one is way better. Spider-Man 2099, Miguel O'Hara, was created by Peter David and Rick Leonardi in 1992. He is one of the older Spider-Man variants on this list. Peak 90s, that moment of looking forward to a weird cyberpunk future. He has stuck around and showed up in various video games and comics ever since. The version that we get in the Across the Spider-Verse film is a bit different because he's more antagonistic and like weirdly giant in a way that the classic Spider-Man 2099 wasn't. It's an interesting different spin to take on this character. Spider-Man India is one that I absolutely adore. When I was a teenager, I went to a school with a very large South Asian population. Issues of this comic were being passed around in the playground and in classrooms. People were saying, look at it, it's brilliant, it's a Spider-Man who looks like us. It was so wonderful to see their enthusiasm for this. As a comic itself, I do think it's really interesting. It's got Pavita Pravakar, who is the Peter Parker of the story, whose Uncle Bim dies, and so a lot of the beats are the same as the classic Spider-Man story. But what's interesting is the things that change in the adaptation. I would definitely recommend that you read it if you have not done so. Anyway, after a limited mini-series, which I feel like was more aimed at the Indian market than anything else at the time, Spider-Man India just kind of disappeared for many, many years before turning up in the Spider-Verse comics and then getting reinvented entirely for the Spider-Verse film. I've heard people say that the film version of this character and that particular design for Pavita is a lot more fitting with Indian culture, and I can't necessarily comment on that myself. All I can say is that it definitely is very eye-catching and interesting, and I do really like this minifigure. Cyborg Spider-Woman. Yup. This is one that I wouldn't necessarily have had as my top pick because she's not in a huge amount of the Spider-Verse film. With a few of these on the rest of the list, you will notice that they're very blink and you miss it in their appearances in the film. I can think of several other Spider-Women I would have rather had in this slot, but I appreciate that this one has shown up in action figure form. I get the sense that she might be a fairly noteworthy design for the design team, and she might be a fairly noteworthy one for selling merchandise. So for that reason she might be included over other characters. It might also be, and this is just me crossing my fingers, I have absolutely no insight into this whatsoever, but it might be that, say, the Jessica Drew Spider-Woman from the film is being saved for another series of collectible minifigures down the line. One can only hope. I'm just remembering what they did with the LEGO Batman film. Sun-Spider, Charlotte Charlie Weber. This one is fantastic. This one really speaks to the ethos of Marvel Comics and what the comics have always been about and what Stan Lee was trying to achieve with them 50, 60 years ago at this point. After Into the Spider-Verse, the first Spider-Verse film released, a bunch of people hit up Tumblr and Twitter and Instagram and all of the image-sharing social media sites to share their own versions of Spider-Man, to come up with their own different Spider-Sonas. I even made one myself for my wife and my kid. And clearly the people behind the film loved them because they made an announcement saying we are going to be including some of these fan-designed Spider characters in the next film. One thing I really love about the producers of the Spider-Verse film, Phil Lord and Chris Miller, who also did the Lego movie, is they're really good at getting the fan community. Like, I really feel they understand the Spider-Man fans with the Spider-Verse films, just like I feel they really understand the Lego fan community with the Lego movie and its various sequels. One of these fan-designed Spider-Sonas was created by Dane Broder, Sun-Spider. She has Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, EDS, much like her creator. This means that she fights crime with crutches and uses a wheelchair. She has to take regular breaks from spidering in order to recover. You do see a little bit of that in the film as she makes a joke about using humour as a crutch. This, I think, is so perfect because not only, much like the Prowler, was this the work of a fan of Spider-Man, but also what's more Marvel than a superhero with a disability fighting crime? Stan Lee, for example, made the active decision to put the most powerful telepath in the Marvel Universe in a wheelchair. He also had the idea of creating a blind superhero, and I remember him talking about Daredevil and saying how he was really worried that he was going to get some pushback, and there were some people who were like, are we sure that this is appropriate? Is this culturally sensitive to have a blind person fighting crime? He went ahead with it anyway and got so much positive fan mail from people saying, thank you so much for reflecting me or this person that I know in comic book form. That is pure Marvel, and so having a superhero who fights crime despite needing a wheelchair and crutches, that is absolutely in keeping with the decades and decades of Marvel lore that we've got up to this point. Peter B. Parker and Mayday. You know the origin of Peter B. Parker. He's Peter Parker but taken to the logical extreme because Peter's life is always, always, always terrible, and it's more fun that way. I don't like reading Spider-Man comics when Peter Parker is happy. No one likes Peter Parker in Spider-Man 3 when he's really on top of the world having a great old time. We love to see him suffer because that's what makes him so relatable. I remember reading once that Stan Lee was writing Spider-Man comics and felt like he was trying desperately to think of more and more things to throw at Peter because it genuinely makes the drama of the whole thing so much more interesting. Yes, it's cool to see whether or not Spider-Man beats a villain, but it's more important to know how he's dealing with his monetary issues or looking after his ailing aunt or trying to balance all of the different girls that he's trying to spend time with despite having so much else on his plate. That's what makes Spider-Man so interesting in my personal opinion, and you see that reflected in Peter B. Parker. What if Spider-Man were a little bit older, a little bit more tired, and now a dad? Mayday here, his adorable little baby. Oh, I was so excited when I knew that Mayday was going to be in this film because she not only is a reflection of, well, you can see it here myself, the Spider-Sona that I drew for my daughter, but also she is a character who has decades of comic book history in and of herself. Mayday Parker, the original, as far as I'm aware, there might have been one before her, but the original Spider-Girl. Spider-Girl had 100 issues in the 90s and the noughties. This comic ran for a very long time and is an imagined future for Spider-Man and his family, wherein Peter is injured in a battle with the Green Goblin and so retires. Years later, his daughter May, nicknamed Mayday, finds his old spider costume, discovers that she has spider powers as well, and goes out to fight crime, continuing in her father's legacy. She and her little brother turn up in a pivotal role in the Spider-Verse comics, but now we have her in adorable little baby form. I think that this is wonderful, just such a brilliant inclusion. I'm very happy with this minifigure. This was on my list. When I made a list of collectible minifigures based on Across the Spider-Verse that I wanted to see, this one is the most important one for me. And I've got to say, looking at it, I feel... Web Slinger. Alright, this one is nice and straightforward. For that Spider-Verse comics event, they needed a bunch of extra spider characters to sit around in the background. Web Slinger was invented for that reason. He does have some appearances in the comics as well, alongside Spider-Horse here. It's great to see it in the film. It's great to see this in Lego form. It's not the one with the greatest depth to it because it's a cowboy Spider-Man and a Spider-Horse. Now, Spider-Bite is interesting because she started out like a bunch of other spider variants on this list, really only there to fill out crowd scenes. Marvel have discovered the wonderful joy of printing money by giving various different creators the opportunity to make their own spider variant, and they've been doing that for quite a while now, and so she was once upon a time no more relevant to these big spider crossover events than, say, Web Slinger. That changed though with the film, where she was plucked from relative obscurity and given a very important starring role. Spider-Bite, aka Margot Kess, has the gimmick of being a VR warrior, I guess you could say. She is a spider-themed superhero, but only inside a digital world. She works for the Cybercrimes Investigation Team in a distant, imaginary, far-flung future where people's online presences are just as important to them as their offline personas. Can you imagine such a thing? It's occurred to me that I haven't mentioned the cat. Here is a spider cat. Here is the spider cat in the film. I also haven't mentioned the spider that comes with Miles Morales. This is the spider that bites Miles in the first film in order to give him his spider powers. Also, Spider-Man 2099 is holding a little hologram of his assistant Lila, which is a very nice inclusion. Love the little heart eyes here. Finally, Spider-Wolf, aka Werewolf Spider-Man. This is one that I thought was going to be straightforward because it's Spider-Man but a werewolf, right? But actually, the history and the lore behind this one is easily one of the more convoluted. Right, so going back all the way to the start, remember the Ultimate Universe? Remember there's Ultimate Spider-Man, there's Ultimate X-Men, there's Ultimate Avengers, which are just called the Ultimates, and then there's Ultimate Fantastic Four. And the Ultimate Fantastic Four do a bunch of weird stuff. The characters are all a little bit younger, and you've got Reed Richards, who I am not even going to be able to go into all of the stuff that happens to Ultimate Reed Richards, but imagine him as kind of like a teenager or a young adult, and he's hanging out with his fantastic friends, and he gets a message from another dimension. A different Reed Richards is reaching out to him, and it looks to be the Reed Richards from the mainline Marvel universe, the 616 universe, and they're chatting for a while, and everything seems very nice, and so teenage Ultimate Reed goes across dimensions to go and visit older, more traditional Reed, and there he discovers that actually he's been tricked, because it's not the traditional Reed Richards after all, it's zombie Reed Richards. This is an entire universe of Marvel zombies. There was a short comics arc with the Marvel Zombies in Ultimate Fantastic Four. I really enjoyed it personally. Magneto is the good guy of the story because he is the last super character left who has not been turned into a zombie, and he can just throw cars at the zombies to keep them at a distance. It is wonderful. After this comic arc wrapped up, Marvel Zombies proved to be very popular, so Marvel got Robert Kirkman involved to write a new Marvel Zombies ongoing series, Robert Kirkman being the Walking Dead guy. In the Fantastic Four Marvel Zombies story, Spider-Man is not very important, but he is front and centre in what Kirkman does with the long-running series. I'm not going to go into all of that here, but that runs for a very long time, proves very popular. You'll have seen elements of this if you've seen, for example, one of the Spider-Man film that had Mysterio in it. Is that Far From Home? Far From Home has a little bit of a zombie in it, but then you see more of it in What If and What If Zombies and all of that jazz. Marvel Zombies then crosses over, and this is really getting convoluted at this point, with Army of Darkness, the Sam Raimi film.
Groovy.
There was a short-run series of comics called Marvel Zombies / Army of Darkness, in which Ash Williams from the Evil Dead franchise ends up in the Marvel Zombies universe fighting all the Marvel zombies. And at the end of that comic, he gets thrown into a different universe where he discovers that now he's in the Marvel Werewolf universe. And that's where it ends on that terrible joke. That is genuinely the introduction of Werewolf Spider-Man, who then ended up being used in the film as well. If we were talking about the origin of Werewolf Captain America, that's a whole different kettle of fish. I'm not going anywhere near that.
It's over!
And that is an explanation of every single minifigure in the Across the Spider-Verse Collectable minifigure series. Let us know your favourite of these in the comments down below, and do all of the rest of the YouTube things. Give this video a thumbs up, hit subscribe and the notification bell. If you're going to be making any LEGO.com purchases in the near future, you can use the affiliate link which is in the description, or the QR code that is currently on screen. They take you straight to the LEGO website. We get a percentage of the sale. It doesn't cost you a penny extra, but it helps to keep the lights on at Brick Fanatics. Speaking of, you can go to brickfanatics.com for coverage of all things LEGO, and sign up to our newsletter so that you never miss anything LEGO related ever again. Thank you very much for watching, and have a wonderful day.